They found the photograph in his jacket pocket 3 days after he died. A German woman with dark hair and careful eyes, standing in front of a bombed-out building in Munich. On the back, written in pencil, just 4 words: "Forgive me for everything." For 50 years, that photograph sat in a classified file at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody knew why an American intelligence officer carried her picture to his grave. Until now. His name was Captain James Sullivan, Irish-American, Boston accent, 28 years old when the war ended. Before 1943, he sold insurance and went to church on Sundays. He wasn't supposed to be a spy. None of them were. But the Office of Strategic Services needed men who could disappear into a crowd, men who spoke German, men willing to do things the regular army couldn't. Sullivan spoke German because his mother was from Stuttgart. She taught him the language in their kitchen while his father worked the docks. That language would save his life. It would also destroy it. In the winter of 1944, Sullivan was dropped behind enemy lines in southern Germany. His mission was simple on paper: gather intelligence on German supply routes, identify key railway hubs, report troop movements, send encrypted messages back to Allied command, stay invisible. The OSS gave him forged papers, a cover story, and a cyanide pill sewn into his coat lining. They told him if he got caught, the United States government would deny he ever existed. He understood. They all did. He entered Germany posing as a Swiss journalist named Eduard Reinhardt. He had the right clothes, the right mannerisms, the right answers. He rented a small room above a bakery in a town called Rosenheim, about 40 miles from Munich. The town was still standing, but barely. Every night, the distant rumble of Allied bombers reminded everyone that the war was closing in. Sullivan kept to himself. He walked the streets, he took notes, he watched the trains. He became invisible, just like they taught him. It was late February when he met her. The snow had turned to slush, and the streets smelled like coal smoke and wet stone. He was sitting in a cafe near the train station, pretending to read a newspaper, when she walked in. Her name was Anna Bergman. She wore a gray coat that had been mended too many times and carried a leather satchel over her shoulder. She ordered black coffee, nothing else. Sullivan noticed her hands first. They were shaking, not from cold, from something else. She sat at the table next to him. He didn't look up. That was the rule. Never make eye contact unless necessary. But then she dropped her satchel and papers spilled across the floor. Medical documents, ration cards, a letter with a Nazi Party seal. Sullivan's instinct screamed at him to stay still, to let her pick them up herself. But she looked at him just for a second, and he saw something in her expression that made him move. He knelt down and helped her gather the papers. Their hands touched briefly. She pulled back like she'd been burned. She thanked him in German. Her voice was quiet, cautious. He replied in the same language, keeping his tone polite but distant. She asked if he was new to Rosenheim. He gave her his cover story, Swiss journalist, documenting the resilience of small towns during wartime. She nodded slowly, studying his face like she was trying to decide if he was telling the truth. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a happy smile, a tired one. The kind of smile that comes from someone who's forgotten what hope feels like. Over the next few weeks, Sullivan kept running into her. At first, he thought it was coincidence. Then he realized she worked at the town's hospital, and her route home passed the same streets he used for surveillance. He told himself to stay away. Getting close to anyone was dangerous, but there was something about her that pulled at him. Maybe it was the way she walked with her shoulders hunched, like she was trying to make herself smaller. Or maybe it was the way she looked at the wounded soldiers brought into the hospital, with a mix of pity and quiet rage. One evening in March, Sullivan was following a German supply officer when he saw her again. She was standing outside the hospital, smoking a cigarette. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red, and there was blood on her apron. He should have walked past her. Instead, he stopped. He asked if she was all right. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she started to cry. Not loud, just silent tears running down her face. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed. She said she'd lost 3 patients that day. Boys, she called them. Just boys. Some of them weren't even 18. Sullivan didn't know what to say. He wasn't supposed to feel sympathy for the enemy. But standing there, watching this woman break under the weight of something she couldn't control, he didn't see an enemy. He saw someone drowning. He offered to walk her home. She hesitated, then agreed. They didn't talk much. The streets were dark and the air smelled like burning wood. When they reached her building, she turned to him and said something that made his chest tighten. She said she knew he wasn't Swiss. She said she'd known from the first day. Sullivan's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol hidden under his coat, but she didn't move. She didn't scream. She just looked at him with those tired eyes and said she didn't care who he was. She said the war had taken everything from her already. Her husband had been killed at Stalingrad. Her brother had been executed for speaking against the party. She had nothing left to lose. Then she asked him a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She asked if he thought any of them would survive this. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth was, he didn't know. And for the first time since he'd landed in Germany, Captain James Sullivan felt something more dangerous than fear. He felt connection. He felt like someone had looked past the lie and seen the man underneath. And in that moment, everything he'd been trained to do, everything he'd been told to believe, started to crack. She turned to go inside, but before she did, she said one more thing. She said if he ever needed help, she would give it. No questions asked. Then she disappeared into the building, and Sullivan stood there in the cold, staring at the door, knowing he'd just crossed a line he could never uncross. The snow started falling again. Somewhere in the distance, an air raid siren began to wail. Sullivan stopped sending reports to London, not all at once, just gradually. He'd send information about troop movements, railway schedules, supply lines, but he started leaving things out. Small things at first, a convoy he'd seen but didn't mention, a munitions depot he'd discovered but never reported. He told himself it didn't matter. The Allies were winning anyway. The Third Reich was collapsing. What difference would a few missing details make? But deep down, he knew the truth. He was protecting her. Anna had become his weakness, and in wartime, weakness got you killed. They started meeting in secret. A bench near the river, a quiet corner of the hospital courtyard, once in the ruins of an old church that had been gutted by bombs. They never touched. They barely even looked at each other when they spoke. But the conversations went deeper than anything Sullivan had ever experienced. She told him about her husband, a school teacher who'd been drafted and sent east. She told him about her brother, who'd been arrested by the Gestapo for hiding a Jewish family in his basement. She told him about the guilt she carried every single day, knowing she worked in a hospital that treated SS officers, while innocent people were being murdered just miles away. Sullivan listened. He didn't judge. He couldn't, because he was lying to her, too. She knew he wasn't Swiss, but she didn't know he was American. She didn't know he was OSS. She didn't know that every piece of information she casually mentioned, every detail about the hospital or the soldiers or the officers who came through town, was intelligence he could use, and sometimes he did use it. He hated himself for it, but he did it anyway, because that's what war does. It turns you into someone you don't recognize. In early April, everything changed. Sullivan intercepted a communication that made his blood run cold. The SS was planning to evacuate a nearby labor camp, not to liberate the prisoners, to eliminate them. The order was clear: no witnesses, no evidence, just bodies buried in unmarked graves before the Americans arrived. Sullivan had 48 hours to get the information to Allied command. If he acted fast, he could save hundreds of lives, maybe more. But there was a problem. The communication mentioned the hospital in Rosenheim. They needed medical personnel to accompany the SS unit, and Anna's name was on the list. He found her that night. She was walking home from her shift, moving slowly through the darkened streets. He grabbed her arm and pulled her into an alley. She gasped, startled, but when she saw his face, her fear turned to confusion. He told her everything. Not about being American, not about the OSS, but about the camp, about the order, about what the SS was planning to do. He told her she couldn't go. He told her she had to refuse, to hide, to run, anything but get on that truck. Anna stared at him. Her face went pale. She asked how he knew this. He couldn't answer. She asked again, louder this time, her voice cracking. How did he know? Sullivan looked at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived in Germany, he told someone the truth. He told her he was a spy. He told her he worked for the Americans. He told her he'd been lying to her from the beginning. And then he waited for her to scream, to run, to turn him in. But she didn't do any of those things. She just stood there, trembling, tears streaming down her face, and then she said the words that broke him. She said, she already knew. She'd known for weeks, maybe longer. She'd seen the way he watched people, the way he asked questions that seemed innocent, but weren't. The way he always positioned himself near exits, near windows, near escape routes. She'd known, and she'd stayed silent. Because in a world where everyone was lying, where everyone was playing a role just to survive, she'd found someone who made her feel human again. Even if it was all built on deception, even if it was doomed from the start. Sullivan asked her why she didn't report him. She said she didn't know. Maybe because she was tired of being afraid. Maybe because she wanted to believe there was still goodness somewhere in the world, even if it came from the enemy. Or maybe, she said, it was because she'd fallen in love with a man that didn't exist, and now she didn't know what to do with that. They stood there in the alley, two people on opposite sides of a war, both lost in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Sullivan made a decision. He told her to pack a bag. He told her he'd get her out. There were routes, safe houses, ways to move refugees through Allied lines. It would be dangerous, but it was possible. She could disappear. She could survive. But Anna shook her head. She said she couldn't leave. There were patients who needed her. There were people in the town who depended on her. And if she ran, the SS would suspect something. They'd start asking questions. They'd start looking for answers. And if they found out about Sullivan, he'd be executed, publicly, as a warning to anyone else who might be working against the Reich. Sullivan tried to argue. He begged her, but she was resolute. She said she'd made her choice a long time ago. She'd stayed in Germany when she could have fled. She'd worked in that hospital when she could have hidden. She'd lived with the guilt and the horror and the shame because she believed that even in the darkest places, someone had to try to do good. And she wasn't going to stop now. Not for him, not for anyone. The next morning, Anna boarded the truck with the SS unit. Sullivan watched from a distance, his hands clenched so tight his nails drew blood. He could have stopped it. He could have killed the officers. He could have blown his cover and created a distraction. But he didn't do it, because she'd asked him not to. She'd made him promise that no matter what happened, he'd stay alive. He'd finish his mission. He'd make sure the information reached the Allies. And he'd remember her, not as a German, not as the enemy, but as someone who chose compassion in a world that had forgotten what it meant. Sullivan sent the report to London that night. The Allies moved faster than expected. The camp was liberated 2 days later. 347 people survived because of the intelligence he provided. The newspapers called it a miracle, a triumph of Allied coordination. Nobody mentioned the German nurse who'd been forced to witness the aftermath. Nobody mentioned the prisoners who'd been shot in the final hours before the Americans arrived. Nobody mentioned the cost. Sullivan never saw her again. After the liberation, he was pulled out of Germany and reassigned. He spent the rest of the war in London, analyzing reports, debriefing agents, doing the quiet work that nobody remembers. When Germany surrendered, he was offered a position with the newly formed CIA. He declined. He went back to Boston. He tried to sell insurance again. He tried to go to church on Sundays. But the man who came home wasn't the same man that had left. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't pray. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face in that alley, tears streaming down her cheeks, telling him she'd fallen in love with someone that didn't exist. He tried to find her after the war. He wrote letters to Rosenheim. He contacted the Red Cross. He searched displaced persons records. Nothing. It was like she'd vanished. Some nights he told himself she'd survived. She'd rebuilt her life somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the memories. Other nights, he knew the truth. She'd been caught in the chaos of the final days, killed in an air raid, executed by retreating SS units, lost in the collapse of a regime that had devoured its own people. In 1952, Sullivan received a package. No return address, just a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the photograph, the one they'd eventually find in his jacket pocket, the one with the 4 words on the back. It had been taken in Munich in the summer of 1946. Anna was standing in front of a ruined building, thinner than he'd remembered, older, but alive. On the back, in her handwriting, "Forgive me for everything." He never found out who sent it. He never found out where she was. He carried that photograph for 23 years until the day he died of a heart attack in a grocery store parking lot in Brookline, Massachusetts. The CIA collected his personal effects. They classified the photograph. They buried the story. Because that's what they do with secrets that don't fit the narrative. They erase them. But the story didn't die. It just waited. Waited for someone to ask the right questions. Waited for the files to be declassified. Waited for the truth to surface, the way truth always does, no matter how deep you bury it. This is that story, the one they didn't want you to hear, the one about a spy who fell in love with the enemy and had to choose between his mission and his heart. He chose the mission. He saved hundreds of lives, but he spent the rest of his life wondering if he'd made the right choice, wondering if love, even in wartime, even across enemy lines, was worth more than victory.